Picture this. A man walks through his front door after years of being away. His family rushes to embrace him, tears of joy streaming down their faces. The neighborhood celebrates his return with flags and welcome signs. But as the cameras stop rolling and the crowd disperses, this hero sits alone in his childhood bedroom, staring at walls that once felt like home but now feel like a prison. The question isn't whether he made it back alive. It's whether the person who left ever truly returned. Before we dive into this heart-wrenching story, I want to know something about you, my incredible viewers. Tell me in the comments below, which country are you watching this video from? I love connecting with people from around the world, and your stories always inspire the content I create. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because stories like these need to be heard, shared, and remembered. Now, let me ask you something deeper. Have you ever returned to a place that was supposed to feel like home, only to realize that either you've changed so much, or the place has changed so much that nothing feels familiar anymore? That disconnect, that feeling of being a stranger in your own life, multiply that by 1,000, and you might begin to understand what countless soldiers experience every single day. Today's story isn't just about one soldier. It's about the invisible wounds that don't make headlines, the battles that continue long after the war ends, and the families who welcome home someone who looks like their loved one but struggles to remember who they used to be. This is the story of Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, a decorated war veteran whose greatest battle began the moment he stepped off the plane and back into civilian life. Michael Rodriguez was 22 years old when he first enlisted in the Army. Born and raised in a small town, he was the kind of young man who held doors open for strangers, helped elderly neighbors with their groceries, and never missed Sunday dinner with his family. His friends would later say that Michael had this infectious laugh that could light up any room, and his mother, Maria, would always brag about how her son could fix anything with his hands and solve any problem with his heart. The decision to join the military wasn't driven by financial necessity or lack of other options. Michael had been accepted to the local community college and had a standing job offer at his uncle's construction company. But something deeper called to him, a sense of duty, a desire to serve something greater than himself, and perhaps, like many young men his age, a need to prove that he could handle whatever life threw at him. His deployment to Afghanistan came just 18 months after enlisting. The excitement in his voice during those early phone calls home was unmistakable. He talked about the landscape, the people he was serving alongside, and his conviction that he was making a difference. His letters to his girlfriend, Sarah, were filled with plans for their future together, dreams of the house they would buy, and promises that he would return home a better man. For the first year, those promises seemed attainable. Michael's unit was primarily involved in infrastructure projects, building schools, repairing roads, and establishing communication networks in remote villages. He sent pictures home of himself teaching local children how to play baseball, helping to construct a medical clinic, and sharing meals with village elders. These were the moments that fed his soul and reinforced his belief that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. But war has a way of changing even the most carefully planned missions. Nobody talks about the specific incident that changed everything for Michael. Not his family, not his friends, and certainly not Michael himself. What we do know comes from official military reports, medical records, and the fragmented pieces that Michael has shared with his therapist over the years. Information that has slowly made its way to those who love him and are desperately trying to understand what happened to the man they once knew. It was a Tuesday morning in March when Michael's unit was called to investigate reports of unusual activity in a village they had visited many times before. This was supposed to be a routine patrol, the kind of mission they had completed hundreds of times without incident. The village elder, a man named Hassan whom Michael had grown particularly fond of, had sent word that strangers had been asking questions about the American soldiers and their schedules. Michael was the point man that day, the soldier who walks ahead of the group, scanning for dangers and making first contact with civilians. It was a role he had requested specifically because he had developed the best relationships with the local population and spoke enough of the local dialect to communicate basic information. His commanding officer had initially hesitated to approve the request, but Michael's track record and the trust he had built within the community made him the logical choice. The explosion happened at 11:47 a.m. local time. The improvised explosive device had been carefully buried in a location that the soldiers passed every time they visited this particular village, a spot that had been safe hundreds of times before. The blast killed 3 soldiers instantly and left 2 others with life-changing injuries. Michael, being the closest to the explosion, should have been among the fatalities. Instead, he found himself thrown 15 feet backward, his body battered and his hearing gone, but somehow still alive. What haunted Michael wasn't just the physical trauma of the explosion or even the loss of his fellow soldiers. It was the realization that Hassan, the village elder he had trusted, had been the one to provide the information that led to the attack. The man who had shared meals with Michael, who had taught him local customs, who had shown him pictures of his grandchildren. This same man had calculated exactly when and where the American soldiers would be most vulnerable. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound could have reached. Michael's physical recovery took place in a military hospital overseas, followed by months of rehabilitation at a medical facility. The official reports documented his injuries in clinical terms: moderate traumatic brain injury, partial hearing loss in his left ear, shrapnel wounds to his legs and torso, and psychological trauma consistent with combat stress reaction. What the reports couldn't capture was the way Michael's eyes had changed, how they now held a distance that hadn't been there before, a wariness that seemed to evaluate every person and situation as a potential threat. His family visited him every weekend during his recovery. They brought home-cooked meals, updated him on neighborhood gossip, and tried to maintain the kind of light, familiar conversations that had once come so naturally. But there was something different about these interactions now. Maria later described it as feeling like they were talking to Michael through a thick glass wall. They could see him, and he could see them, but somehow the connection that had once been so effortless now required tremendous effort from both sides. Sarah, his girlfriend, tried the hardest to bridge that gap. She brought photo albums filled with pictures from their high school days, played his favorite music, and planned elaborate dates for when he would finally be discharged. But Michael's responses were increasingly distant and perfunctory. He would nod at the right moments, smile when it seemed appropriate, and ask questions that demonstrated he was listening. But Sarah could feel that he was performing the role of her boyfriend rather than actually being present in the relationship. The medical team prepared Michael and his family for the challenges of reintegration. They explained that many soldiers experience difficulty adjusting to civilian life, that nightmares and anxiety are common, and that the process of healing often takes much longer than the physical recovery. They provided pamphlets about support groups, contact information for counselors who specialized in working with veterans, and reassurance that with time and proper care, Michael would learn to manage his symptoms and rebuild his life. What they didn't prepare anyone for was the possibility that the Michael who came home might be fundamentally different from the Michael who had left. The day Michael returned home was everything his family had dreamed about during those long months of his deployment and recovery. The local newspaper covered his homecoming with a front-page story titled, "Local Hero Returns." The mayor presented him with a key to the city. His old high school football coach organized a welcome reception at the community center, complete with yellow ribbons, American flags, and a banner that read, "Welcome home, hero." Michael played his part perfectly. He shook hands with well-wishers, posed for photographs with local dignitaries, and gave a brief speech thanking everyone for their support. Those who attended the reception later said that Michael seemed humble and grateful, perhaps a bit quieter than they remembered, but considering what he had been through, his composure was remarkable. But heroes aren't supposed to cry themselves to sleep every night. Heroes aren't supposed to jump at the sound of car doors slamming or garbage trucks backing up. Heroes aren't supposed to check and recheck the locks on their doors 3 times before going to bed, or to sleep with a baseball bat next to their bed just in case. Heroes aren't supposed to find themselves unable to be in crowded places, to trust new people, or to feel safe in their own hometown. Within weeks of his return, it became clear that Michael's adjustment to civilian life was going to be more complicated than anyone had anticipated. He had difficulty sleeping, often staying awake until dawn and then sleeping through most of the day. He struggled to maintain conversations, frequently losing track of what people were saying or becoming overwhelmed by simple decisions like what to order at a restaurant or which movie to watch. The job his uncle had held for him at the construction company lasted less than a month. Michael's supervisor, a family friend who had known him since childhood, later described the experience as heartbreaking. Michael would show up to work on time and follow instructions perfectly, but he seemed to be operating on autopilot. He had no interest in joking around with his coworkers, no patience for the small talk that makes long workdays bearable, and no tolerance for the minor frustrations that are part of any job. The final straw came when a car backfired in the parking lot during lunch break. Michael dove behind a pile of construction materials and stayed there for 20 minutes, convinced that they were under attack. His coworkers, well-meaning but unprepared for this kind of reaction, tried to convince him that everything was okay, that it was just a car, that he was safe. But Michael couldn't hear them through the memories that had been triggered, memories of explosions, of friends dying, of never being able to trust that any moment was truly safe. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a term that gets thrown around a lot in discussions about veterans, but understanding what it actually means requires looking beyond the clinical definition. For Michael, PTSD wasn't just about having nightmares or being startled by loud noises. It was about the way his brain had been rewired by trauma, creating new neural pathways that prioritized survival over everything else. In Afghanistan, Michael's hypervigilance had kept him alive. His ability to scan his environment for threats, to assess the intentions of every person he encountered, and to prepare for the worst-case scenario in any situation had been essential skills. But those same skills, transplanted into the context of civilian life, made normal life nearly impossible. Going to the grocery store became an ordeal that required careful planning and tremendous mental energy. Michael would map out the most efficient route through the store, identify all the exits, and position himself so that he could see as much of his surroundings as possible. He couldn't concentrate on his shopping list because too much of his attention was devoted to monitoring the behavior of other shoppers, listening for sounds that might indicate danger, and preparing for threats that existed only in his traumatized mind. Relationships became even more complicated. Michael found himself unable to trust people's motives or to take their words at face value. Sarah's efforts to plan romantic dinners were interpreted as attempts to make him vulnerable. His mother's questions about his day felt like interrogations. His friends' invitations to social gatherings seemed like potential ambushes. The most painful part of Michael's struggle was his awareness of what he had lost. He could remember being the kind of person who enjoyed simple pleasures, watching movies, playing cards with friends, taking long drives without any particular destination. He could remember feeling safe in his own skin, confident in his ability to handle whatever challenges life might present. But those memories felt like they belonged to someone else, someone who had died in that explosion along with his fellow soldiers. While Michael was fighting his internal war, his family was waging their own battle to understand and support him. Maria, his mother, threw herself into research about PTSD, reading everything she could find about the condition and reaching out to other military families who had faced similar challenges. She attended support groups, consulted with therapists, and tried to create an environment that would feel safe and healing for her son. But love, no matter how fierce and unconditional, isn't always enough to bridge the gap that trauma creates. Michael's father, Roberto, struggled with his own feelings of helplessness and frustration. He had always been the kind of man who could fix anything with enough effort and determination. When Michael's bicycle broke as a child, Roberto repaired it. When Michael needed help with homework, Roberto found a way to explain even subjects he didn't understand himself. When Michael faced disappointment or heartbreak, Roberto knew how to offer comfort and perspective. But this was different. This wasn't something that could be fixed with tools and elbow grease. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with a father's wisdom and encouragement. This was a wound that Roberto couldn't see, couldn't understand, and couldn't heal, no matter how desperately he wanted to. The tension in the Rodriguez household became palpable. Family dinners, once filled with laughter and easy conversation, became strained affairs where everyone was walking on eggshells, afraid to say something that might trigger one of Michael's episodes. Maria found herself constantly monitoring her son's mood, looking for signs that he was having a bad day and adjusting her behavior accordingly. Roberto began working longer hours, partly to provide for the family's increased medical expenses, but also because he didn't know how to be around this version of his son. Michael's younger sister, Anna, was perhaps the most affected by the changes in their family dynamic. She was a senior in high school when Michael returned home, at an age when she needed her family's attention and support as she navigated her own challenges and prepared for college. But the family's energy and resources were now entirely focused on Michael's recovery, leaving Anna feeling invisible and resentful. The guilt that came with that resentment was almost unbearable. Anna loved her brother and understood intellectually that he was struggling with something beyond his control. But emotionally, she mourned the loss of the family she had known before the deployment, the brother who had once been her protector and confidant, and the parents who had once been available to help her with her own problems. 18 months after Michael's return, the Rodriguez family reached their breaking point. The incident that finally forced them to confront the reality of their situation happened on a Thursday evening in October. Michael had been having what his family considered a relatively good week. He had been sleeping better, had shown some interest in watching football with his father, and had even laughed at one of Anna's jokes during dinner. But that evening, a neighbor's dog got loose and ran into the Rodriguez backyard while Michael was sitting on the porch. The dog, a friendly golden retriever named Max, had visited their yard countless times before the deployment and had always been welcomed by Michael. But on this particular evening, the sound of the dog running through the yard triggered something in Michael's mind that transported him back to Afghanistan. In his traumatized state, Michael couldn't distinguish between the harmless family pet and the wild dogs that had sometimes approached his unit's camp in search of food. He saw a threat that needed to be eliminated, and he reacted with the same decisiveness and violence that had kept him alive in a war zone. The details of what happened next are too painful for the family to discuss in detail. What matters is that by the time Michael's father was able to restrain him and bring him back to the present moment, it was clear that the situation had escalated beyond what the family could handle on their own. That night, as they sat in the emergency room waiting for a psychiatrist to evaluate Michael, the Rodriguez family finally acknowledged what they had been trying to deny for over a year. The son and brother they had known and loved was gone, and they needed professional help to learn how to love and support the man he had become. Michael's treatment began with a 30-day inpatient stay at a facility that specialized in treating veterans with PTSD. For the first time since his return, he was surrounded by people who understood what he was experiencing. Not just the medical staff, but other veterans who were fighting similar battles. The relief of being in an environment where his symptoms were understood rather than feared was profound. The treatment program was intensive and multifaceted. Michael participated in individual therapy sessions where he slowly began to process the trauma he had experienced. He attended group therapy sessions where he learned that many of his struggles were shared by other veterans. He worked with occupational therapists to develop coping strategies for managing his symptoms in daily life. He met with psychiatrists who helped him understand how his brain had been affected by trauma and what medications might help stabilize his mood and reduce his anxiety. Perhaps most importantly, Michael began to understand that his symptoms weren't a sign of weakness or failure. They were the normal response of a healthy brain to abnormal circumstances. The hypervigilance that made grocery shopping difficult had kept him alive in a combat zone. The emotional numbing that made relationships challenging had protected him from being overwhelmed by grief and loss. The nightmares that disrupted his sleep were his mind's way of processing experiences that were too traumatic to understand while awake. This realization didn't cure Michael's PTSD, but it did give him a framework for understanding his condition and a vocabulary for communicating with his family about what he was experiencing. For the first time since his return, he began to see his symptoms as something that could be managed rather than a life sentence that would forever separate him from the people he loved. The work of rebuilding relationships after trauma is slow and requires patience from everyone involved. Michael's family began attending their own therapy sessions, both individually and as a group, to learn how to support him without sacrificing their own emotional well-being. They learned about the importance of maintaining boundaries, the difference between helping and enabling, and the need to continue living their own lives even while supporting Michael's recovery. Sarah, Michael's girlfriend, made the difficult decision to end their romantic relationship during his second month of treatment. It wasn't because she didn't love him or didn't want to support his recovery. It was because she realized that the relationship they had once shared was based on the person Michael had been before his deployment, and trying to force that dynamic to continue was preventing both of them from moving forward. The breakup was devastating for Michael, but it was also liberating. It freed him from the pressure of trying to be the person Sarah remembered and needed, and it allowed him to focus on discovering who he was becoming. Sarah remained in his life as a friend and supporter, but their relationship evolved into something that could accommodate the changes that trauma had brought to both of their lives. Michael's relationship with his family also required significant adjustments. His parents had to learn to love and support the man he had become rather than grieving for the son they had lost. Anna had to find ways to connect with this new version of her brother while also advocating for her own needs and dreams. The family developed new traditions and ways of communicating that took into account Michael's limitations and triggers, while still maintaining the closeness that had always been central to their family identity. One of the most challenging aspects of Michael's recovery was finding a sense of purpose and meaning in civilian life. The military had provided him with clear missions, defined roles, and a sense of contributing to something larger than himself. Civilian life, in contrast, felt chaotic and meaningless, filled with choices that seemed trivial compared to the life-and-death decisions he had faced in Afghanistan. Michael's breakthrough came when he began volunteering at a local veterans organization that provided support services to recently returned service members. Initially, he was reluctant to take on this role, worried that he wasn't far enough along in his own recovery to be helpful to others. But his therapist encouraged him to try, suggesting that helping others might be an important part of his own healing process. The first veteran Michael worked with was a young woman named Jessica who had served 2 tours in Iraq and was struggling with many of the same challenges Michael had faced. She couldn't sleep, couldn't hold down a job, and was estranged from her family who didn't understand what she was going through. Michael's ability to listen without judgment, to validate her experiences, and to offer practical strategies for managing her symptoms was exactly what she needed. Working with Jessica and other veterans gave Michael something he had been missing since his return: a sense of competence and usefulness. He discovered that his experiences, as painful as they had been, had given him insights and skills that could help others navigate their own recovery journeys. He began training to become a peer counselor, combining his lived experience with formal education about trauma and recovery. This work didn't cure Michael's PTSD, but it gave him a way to make meaning from his suffering and to contribute to something larger than himself. It provided structure and purpose to his days, and it connected him to a community of people who understood what he had been through. 5 years after his return from Afghanistan, Michael's life looked very different from what anyone had expected. He lived in a small apartment near the Veterans Center where he worked, a space that he had carefully designed to feel safe and comfortable. He had developed routines and coping strategies that allowed him to manage his symptoms most of the time, though he still had bad days that required him to retreat and focus on self-care. His relationship with his family had evolved into something that worked for everyone involved. They had regular family dinners, but Michael could leave early if he was feeling overwhelmed. They celebrated holidays and milestones, but they had learned to modify traditions to accommodate Michael's needs. They talked regularly, but they had established boundaries about what topics felt safe and supportive versus those that were too triggering or invasive. Michael had begun dating again, but these relationships were different from his pre-deployment romance with Sarah. He was upfront about his PTSD from the beginning, and he only pursued relationships with people who demonstrated that they could understand and accept his limitations. He had learned that he couldn't be everything to everyone, but he could be genuinely present and caring within the boundaries of what felt safe for him. Perhaps most importantly, Michael had developed a different relationship with his own trauma. He no longer saw his PTSD as something that had ruined his life or made him irreparably broken. Instead, he understood it as a part of his story, a difficult chapter that had taught him important lessons about resilience, empathy, and the complexity of human experience. Michael's story is just one of millions of similar stories playing out in communities around the world. Every veteran who returns from combat deployment faces some version of the challenges that Michael experienced. Some adapt more easily, some struggle more intensely, and some never find their way back to a life that feels meaningful and sustainable. The ripple effects of combat trauma extend far beyond the individual veteran. Families are transformed by the experience of loving someone who has been changed by war. Communities must learn how to support and integrate veterans who return with invisible wounds. Healthcare systems must develop new approaches to treating conditions that previous generations of medical professionals never encountered. But Michael's story also demonstrates the possibility of recovery and growth after trauma. It shows that while people may be forever changed by their experiences, they are not forever defined by them. It illustrates that healing is possible, even when it doesn't look like a return to the way things were before. The work that Michael does with other veterans has created ripple effects of its own. Each person he helps goes on to build a life that works for them, and many of them find ways to help others in turn. The understanding and skills that Michael has developed through his own recovery have been passed on to dozens of other veterans, who have passed them on to their own families and communities. As I finish telling Michael's story, I want to return to the question I asked at the beginning. What does it really mean to come home from war? Michael's journey shows us that coming home isn't just about physical return. It's about the much more complex process of integrating traumatic experiences into a life that can still hold meaning, connection, and hope. Michael Rodriguez did come home from Afghanistan. The young man who left Texas full of idealism and confidence didn't return, but the man who took his place brought with him hard-won wisdom, deep empathy, and a commitment to helping others navigate their own difficult journeys. He learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting or returning to who you were before. It means finding ways to live fully and authentically with the experiences that have shaped you. Today, Michael continues to work with veterans, continues to build relationships with family and friends, and continues to discover new aspects of who he is becoming. His story reminds us that the end of military service is not the end of a veteran's story. It's the beginning of a new chapter that can be just as meaningful and impactful as their service, even if it looks completely different from what anyone expected. The soldier who came home was not the same person who left, but he was not lost either. He was transformed, and in his transformation, he found new ways to serve, to love, and to contribute to the world around him. His journey continues, and in its continuation, there is hope for every veteran who struggles to find their way back to a life that feels like home. If you've made it this far in the video, I want you to know that stories like Michael's are happening all around us. Maybe you know a veteran who is struggling with the transition back to civilian life. Maybe you are a veteran yourself, or a family member who is trying to understand and support someone you love. These stories matter, and they deserve to be heard, understood, and honored. Please take a moment to share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below sharing your own thoughts, experiences, or questions about the topics we've discussed. And remember to subscribe to this channel, because I'm committed to continuing to share stories that matter, stories that help us understand the complexity of human experience and the possibility of healing and growth even after the most difficult circumstances. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and thank you for caring about the stories that often go untold. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.